Welcome to the Good Faith Podcast. I'm your host, Curtis Chang, and the Good Faith Podcast is where friends who follow Jesus help each other make sense of the world. And you would think by that description that we are helping people make sense of the world, that good faith is all about engagement in the world, learning about the world, doing stuff in the world. And that's true. And if you were to think that way and you were to think, well, who's somebody that's disengaged from the world? Who would you picture? You might think of someone like a monk sequestered in a monastery far away from the world, just praying or chanting. But what if? What if this divide between engagement in the world and disengagement from the world actually were meant to coexist in some sort of harmony, that both were meant to be actually active practices of followers of Jesus? What if we all maybe had an inner monk that we actually needed to cultivate, even as we are engaged in the world? That's what I suspect is true. It's been true increasingly of my own experience, and that's why I'm so excited to talk to today's guest. Today's guest is Jared Patrick Boyd. He's a pastor in the Vineyard USA. He's a spiritual director and the founding director of the Order of Common Life. It's a monastic order trying to reimagine religious vocations for the 21st century and for the common person. And so he's also the author of Imaginative Prayer, Finding Freedom in Constraint. And Jared, I'm so excited to talk with you today. Welcome to the Good Faith Podcast.
It's great to be here. Thanks for having me, Curtis.
Well, Jared, I heard you talk about the Order of Common Life, and I immediately thought, wait a minute, he's onto something, and he's onto something that I need to pay attention. And I actually think many people need to pay attention to. So let's just get right into it. Explain, what is this Order of Common Life? What is it and who is it for?
Yeah, let me just start to say that at the very beginning, it's for everyone. We would love it to be the case where everyone could consider a vocational pathway to joining a religious order. And the reason that we would say that is that in history, throughout history, one of the options for people who were in the life of the church would have been to join a religious order. And that didn't always mean to go away into a monastery. So this is how the tradition began, back in the 5th and 6th century with Saint Benedict and those around him. But since then, there's been several innovations within the monastic tradition where we have religious orders who have sprung up all throughout history, serving the poor, teaching, doing educational initiatives. And so there's been like two primary streams of monasticism. And what we are trying to do is we're trying to take the best of history, people like the Jesuits and the Franciscans and the Dominicans in the Catholic Church. And we're trying to harvest the best of what that tradition is and to sort of reimagine it for the 21st century, for the whole church. What's coming to my mind right now is there's a famous ancient proverb that says the cowl or the habit, which is the clothing of a monk, does not make the monk. And so what that means is that the outward sort of trappings of being a monk is not the thing that's important. What we have found in the history of the tradition is that there's something about the interior life of monasticism that runs throughout the whole tradition.
Well, so I am actually in the pre-postulancy stage. After hearing you talk, I thought he's onto something. I want to check this out. My wife and I signed up to be in the pre-postulancy stage. We're going stage, and we're going through it very slowly, which is really nice because, you set this up in a series of videos that you go through regularly, where each session of the pre-postulancy sort of course is you have like a 10 or 12 minute video, which I really think are well done, introducing a spiritual practice that is trying to kind of give you a picture of what monastic life is like. And I would say from my experience, what I really love about it is it gives you a structure, right? So like, I think most of us, like, we want to have a deeper, richer inner life, but we're oftentimes just jerry-rigging it together. It's like, oh, I heard this thing, I read this one thing, and you're sort of duct taping in an ad hoc and highly individualistic manner. There's something really kind of reassuring that I'm being led into an actually structured practice and it's not one that you've just made up. It's one that has stood the test of time throughout church history. I really love that. And I got really curious as I was going through this, is like, because I'm sort of interacting with you. We try to do it every Friday on video, but we don't always succeed. But like, so I'm interacting with you regularly, and you're doing these lovely teachings about these spiritual practices. But the question is like, how did Jared get here?
Hmm.
Like, what's his story for how he came to these sets of practices and then this vision of monastic life? Can you share that story?
Yeah, I would love to. Obviously that's a personal story that I'm happy to share and get to do so quite a bit. But the very beginning of that story would be, it was probably 2004, 2005 when I went through what we now call deconstruction. It was pretty radical deconstruction. I was on staff with a campus ministry. I led my students down to a apologetics conference, and I lost my faith at that apologetics conference. I may be
All
the only
right.
person to have ever done that, but
No.
um,
I've heard that happen before.
yeah, things really just began to crumble, and there were other circumstances going on. I was newly married. But what began to crumble for me was sort of some theological categories. It just didn't make any sense anymore to me. And so I finished up my time on campus ministry, and I sunk into a pretty deep depression, spiritual depression. And I read some theology that really led me out of that in my thinking. But what really captured my heart was I began to pray the hours. And I began to pray the hours initially with Phyllis Tickle's books, the Divine Hours.
Mhm.
And then I discovered the Book of Common Prayer and the Rule of Saint Benedict. And I just began to walk down this little trail that led me into this great whole tradition that no one had ever told me about.
Mm.
And I had grown up in the Vineyard Church. I've been a part of the Vineyard since 1994, so just a little over 30 years now. And I came into the Vineyard in 1994, and I had a profound encounter with the presence and the love of God at the age of 16. What began to happen for me on the other side of deconstruction, as I began to lean into solitude and silence and praying prayers that I had not made up, but others had written,
Yeah.
reading the theology of the early church, is that I began to have that kind of presence of God experience
Yeah.
sort of in the quiet hours of my living room in this like red chair that I picked up at a garage sale, just to give a little detail there.
Yeah.
I began to encounter the presence of God in the monastic sort of contemplative tradition, and found myself that I had become a contemplative. I had begun to experience God. And my prayer life began to be more imaginative prayer. Lectio Divina became sort of a staple of the way I engaged the scriptures. And something just began to happen to me from that tradition. How that turns into like wanting to start a religious order is kind of the rest of the story, which is to say, like I thought I was going to plant a church in 2010. And as I prayed about that, the only thing that God filled my imagination with was the image of an urban monastery. And that was really confusing for me. And so I spent like 2 or 3 years like praying, researching, talking to leaders, and eventually had the courage to say out loud, I think that I'm supposed to try to reimagine what a religious order could be outside the Catholic Church. And I have been doing that now for about 12 years. More publicly for the past 5, because, when you start that kind of journey, I'll just be really candid. I just thought I was like going crazy. Like it's just like, how could I possibly even think about doing this? And God had to do a lot inside of me in order to foster the kind of courage to be able to say out loud what I now can very freely just say, like, I just know that God has called me to do this.
Jared, as I hear your story, it strikes me that this is an illustration of what I began the intro with, was that there's this active interplay between our engagement with the world out
Mm,
there and our need to have some place where we disengage from that and deepen our life with God. And there's this sort of active interplay. So for
mm,
you, it was an apologetics conference and a deconstruction, sort of that triggers, that somehow leads you to this deeper disengagement from that world to more deeply engage with God in the
yeah.
monastic life. I had a similar experience.
Mm,
I think one, as I've been reflecting, how did I deepen my own practices of contemplative prayer and solitude? I think a lot of it was being overwhelmed in,
Mhm.
2016 with Trump's first election and feeling like, oh my gosh, I felt like that was a deeply troubling experience. The world felt chaotic.
Mhm.
And I remember just needing to be quiet, like stop reading the news, stop, going on social media, just be quiet and be still
Mhm.
before God. And that started with 5 minutes, then 10, 15, 20, and it just
Mhm.
became this growing need and desire, and also like pleasure of it. Like it was I started experiencing it like not just a necessary relief, but a deepening pleasure of it. And then I remember the pandemic was like another trigger, like
Mhm.
the world is going crazy. I need to recalibrate my sense of this world, and I can't do that by just reading more headlines about the latest death
Mhm.
toll or something like that. I need to be with God. And again, that was
Yeah.
like another deepening. And I'm finding in this moment, in this political and cultural moment with all the turmoil we have, that's been another just constant drive. Like I need to, I'm still engaged in the world. I'm still doing this podcast. I'm still trying
Mhm.
to lead the after party. I'm still doing all these things, but to actually do that work, engage in the world, I actually need to deepen my disengagement from that world so that I can be present with God.
Mhm.
Can you like, is that a common, like when you talk to people who have come to Order of Common Life, are there versions of this kind of dynamic where the push of the world or the pressures of the world are actually what is triggering this desire for interiority and inner life that requires some disengagement from the, just the pressures and push of outer life?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is just the human condition. I mean, I think even apart from whatever politics that has people all stirred up, I think the human condition is that we will always find things in the world that will grab our attention and that we will latch onto for safety, for security, for a sense of control over the world. And the reality is that that's not how the world works. Like we don't have those kinds of things. We're not guaranteed safety. We're not guaranteed security. All that kind of stuff. We're not guaranteed that we will have people around us that love us. And so I think there's like a natural thing that God has put inside of us to to run to Him whenever we're experiencing those kinds of things. And Curtis, at the center of so much of what we have discovered and so much of what our work has become about is, you mentioned I'm a spiritual director, which means I have an opportunity of sitting with people, for long periods of time and asking them about their experience of God and their experience of prayer. And one of the questions that I've been asking is, when is the last time you experienced being loved by God? Like had an encounter with the love of God? And the reason I've been asking this question so much, not just in spiritual direction, but also in pastoral ministry, is that I've become convinced that, God is infinite love with infinite power to love. And it's kind of a head scratcher as to why we don't get to experience that as much as we think we might want to. Most people, when I ask them when is the last time they experienced the love of God, they're reaching for something that was months ago. Or like, oh, sometime last fall, I remember having this sort of encounter with feeling loved by God. And I just don't think it's the way it's supposed to be. And so I think what the reason that we're experiencing this sort of resurgence of contemplative spirituality and maybe in the tradition it would be called kind of a mystical theology, um, is because people are longing for what they were created for, which is union with God. And so I don't find it surprising at all anymore when people say to me, man, like my life with God started getting really clear when I started practicing more silence and solitude. It doesn't surprise me at all.
Yeah.
So I just think that that's part of what it means to be a human.
Jordan, I want you to telescope out for a moment, because I
Mm,
do think at some level, for individuals, you need to have some sort of experience where, when you're describing this cultivation of inner life, it just rings true. And I don't know if
mm,
it's God has to bring you to that point where you realize, yes, I need that more. I loved what you said about like this recognition, like my last experience of the love of God was months ago, and like
mm,
there's something's wrong with that, right? So there's a sense in which I think every individual needs to sort of discern. But I want you to telescope out kind of at the broad macro level. Like, where are we now as a church? And let's just keep it in modern Western society in America
Mm.
here. Where are we at a church now that makes monasticism especially important for something that we need to consider? Like draw some lessons from history. When else has God used monasticism, and how might that apply to this particular moment?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's pretty clear to most people who are in the quote unquote church business, which I am. I'm a local church pastor as well. The church is in a tremendous crisis right now. Um, Clergy integrity is sort of being brought into question, rightfully so. There's so much clergy abuse happening. Christian nationalism is on the rise. This sense of like that we can somehow hitch our faith wagon to some sort of nationalistic identity. And then the gap between the rich and the poor obviously continues to grow. And that strikes me as actually a crisis in the church as well. And the interesting thing is that obviously this is not the only time in history that this has happened. That kind of sort of constellation of problems would equally describe events, in the 6th century, in the 13th century, in the 16th century. And what we believe and what we notice from history is that in each moment of this kind of church crisis, there has been some sort of reimaginative work of the monastic stream. And so, St. Benedict comes on the scene in the 6th century. St. Francis kind of reimagines monastic life into the city. There's these pivotal moments where we think that the monastic witness is a prophetic witness to the church, to the life of the church. And I think, obviously, that's the work that we're trying to be about. But I think there's all kinds of other people who are recognizing that there's something from this tradition that has been carried through the life of the church that is now becoming even more of a gift and maybe a life raft to us.
I
So,
think
yeah.
I think that's a very profound point, because as somebody who engages on a variety of issues, there's a level in which I feel like, yeah, we need to talk about, Christian nationalism. We need to talk about the breakdown of the family. We need to talk about abortion. We need to talk about euthanasia. We need to talk about technology and
Hmm.
its rise. But it feels a little like whack-a-mole-ish,
Hmm.
but from issue to issue. And when you get underneath all of these issues, you realize one common thread is we are not forming our people
That's
to
right.
be people formed by God in a way that can resist all these pressures and can actually respond to all these different issues in a Christ-centered way. That the formation is the really sort of meta crisis
Hmm.
underneath all of these individual crises. So, what distill down, what is it about the monastic tradition that has an opportunity to form people more deeply than right now the classic model? I'm a member of a church, I go to church on Sunday, maybe I'm a part of a small group, maybe not. I try to have my own personal devotions
Hmm.
sometimes, oftentimes not. Like that, I think describes kind of like the average Christian formation process. And that's probably like at its best at some level.
Yeah.
So what is monasticism trying to bring differently to that picture?
Yeah, that's a great question, and maybe I'll just geek out a little bit here. There's a missiologist, I think, in the 1970s. His name was Ralph Winter, and he talks about the difference, like the concept of church as sort of church in two forms. You've got modality church and sodality,
Mm-hmm.
and modality is just like kind of another way of saying like this is the normal version of church. And that's your Sunday morning gathering, the church on the stage, the proclamation of the word, the Eucharist, all of that kind of stuff. And I just want to be really clear that we absolutely need that. I mean, local church, going to church on Sunday. I mean, this is God's like plan for the world, the whole church. But what Winter recognizes is that there's these like particular moments in the life of the church where like a particular mission or a particular charism emerges that sort of requires a little bit different of a container. And that is his label for that is a sodalic version of church. And that's what religious orders um, sort of fill in the gap with. So we might think of someone like a Mother Teresa who has like had around her a particular mission to serve the poorest of the poor in Calcutta, India. It's not the case that the regular church couldn't have addressed that, but what seems to have happened all throughout history is that God really places a burning desire on a specific community's heart for a specific task.
Mhm.
And I think, honestly, I mean, this is me sort of trailing my coattails a little bit here, but I think that the Protestant church and the evangelical church in particular is in such bad shape because we have not had an imagination for a container that invites people to give their whole life to God
Mm.
in the same way that the Catholic Church has with all of these religious orders. So,
Yeah.
what we're trying to do is say, it seems like the church needs this kind of container to be both a prophetic witness to the church at whole, as
Mm.
well as to the world, that as human beings, we have the capacity to give our whole life to God.
Mm.
And that's where you begin to think about, do you have a religious vocation? Do you have a call on your life to give your whole life to God? And the church needs to have a container for that. And so we're trying to be a part of building that container.
So, who is this for then? Because I can really imagine it being attractive to people who have already discovered what their calling is and realizing, oh my gosh, to sustain that kind of calling, to serve the poor in this way,
Yeah.
to transform the technology field in a redemptive way,
Mm.
to be a person in finance that actually has a kingdom perspective on money and capital. Man, that is so hard. I'm against so many external pressures in the world. I need something more deeper inner resources and inner formation. Maybe this order is going to provide it for me. Like again, I
Mm.
would say that probably characterizes my attraction to it. Was
Mm.
like as I said, the work of engaging in the outer world felt so daunting, and I realized I need a stronger inner life. And so, order of common life. Maybe that I'll provide it. And I'm checking it out. I'm a pre-postulant. See, but what about people who maybe they can't quite right now identify like, oh yeah, that's my mission in the world.
Yeah.
I don't know, I'm not sure. Is the monastic order, is the order of common life going to be helpful to them?
Well, I think it's going to be helpful. I mean, one of the things that we say to people is just come in and try,
Mhm.
and just trust that God will lead you and guide you in the direction. So we, last year I think we had 50 postulants start in January, and we had maybe 22 of those 50 people go on to the next stage and become novices. And less than half of the people who went through postulancy came on to be a novice, and we would say that's fine. This is about discernment,
Mhm.
and I suspect that less than half of those novices will become vowed members. We're talking 4 to 6 years of formation, and along the way, people get what they can, and some people begin to see that there's something inside of them that is so resonating with the kind of life that we're inviting people into. This kind of very imperfect sort of pathway, that they just keep saying yes, and to trying to cultivate a life oriented around our shared rule of life, to maintaining rhythms of work, prayer, rest, and study. Those are our four primary sort of rhythms. So we just keep inviting people. And as long as people still feel an invitation from God, we keep welcoming them onto this formation pathway. So the answer to your question is yes, I think it can be helpful, but it doesn't necessarily mean that everyone needs to become a vowed member.
Yeah. Well, I think that's really important because that's actually true to the historical model of monasticism, that a monastery actually was a primary place of hospitality. Like, that was actually crucial to every, sort of monastery's mission is how do you welcome those who are not monks and give them a picture of a deeper life with God
Yeah.
that may bless them, that they may have to take and integrate into their own life in their own way, not as by becoming a part of the monk. I think that's one of the beautiful pictures of historical monasticism, and I've experienced that in my short sort of stint in the OCL, in the Order of Common Life, because I think you do lay out a very kind of welcoming. It's not rigid. You can go at your own pace. You can check it out, and you are invited to like take the next step, taste this next practice. So that seems like a really helpful model. Uh, Tell me more about what you think might be like signs for people to recognize that, hey, I'm experiencing this. Maybe I should check this out. Like, is it what kind of urges, disturbances, both positive and negative symptoms that they may be experiencing
Mm,
that you think would be like, maybe you should check this out. What would be
yeah.
some of those symptoms?
Man, what a great question. I think that I imagine that really along a spectrum. I mean, I think there's some people that we receive and come to us that their spiritual life feels so out of control
Mhm.
that they're just like, I need rescued. I need something that can put me on a path. I need people around me that can help me walk that path. Some accountability and relationship, some conversation around, the things that God is doing in my life. That would be one person. So
Mhm.
if you're just like, man, I just don't quite know what to do yet, like I feel like I'm losing the thread, we would love an opportunity to introduce you to the love of God in a new and a fresh way. And then the second person I would say is, we get people coming to us who have recognized that there's a deep, deep longing inside of them. That may be the way that which that they have been praying just isn't working anymore. Um, the typical just study of the scriptures just feels like it's fallen flat, and it's like a normal Christian experience. So we encourage people not to be alarmed by any of that, but then there's just like a natural progression in spiritual life where there are deeper things, um, but it's deeper things into the simple things like God loves you. God loves you completely. There's nothing that can separate you from the love of God. We talk about the love of God all the time, until people really begin to grasp that it's true. And so I think if maybe even a third category would be people particularly who struggle with this idea of being loved by
Mm.
God,
Mm.
man, we would love to welcome you into our formation process
Mm.
because I've just come to believe, Curtis, that the primary way that people come to be changed is through an encounter and experience with the love of God. I think it's the only thing that actually does any formational work in our life with Jesus.
We've been talking about this really wonderful, deep historical vision called monasticism. This idea that people can be called to make specific commitments over time to give their whole lives to God so they can more wholly experience the love of God in their life. So, Jared, I want to talk more about this idea of monasticism as a gift, especially as sort of this almost vision of like, what gifts can you distribute to people who don't even come within the walls of your order, right? So when if you think of like the physical vision of a monastery, sometimes you have to enter the monastery to experience and taste like, oh, this is what it's like to give your life fully to God. You get a picture of it.
Mm,
And in the order of common life, that would be like, okay, become a pre-postulant at least, like start checking it out, do the practices, which is what I'm doing. But and we're going to put the links to the OCL. I invite people to check it out, to come in sort of the outer walls
mm,
of your virtual monastery, if you will. But it also strikes me that monasteries exist just by being present. And oftentimes the monks are going out and distributing gifts, distributing the blessings to the wider world that don't even require people to come in to their wall. So if you think of that vision of monastery, what would be the order of common life's distributed gifts to the wider church? What do you want to carry out and tell other people? This is available. You don't even have to become a pre-postulant. You don't even have to come to our website. I just want to tell you this is available and I want to share this with you. What would be some of those spiritual gifts you'd want to go out and share?
yeah, thank you. I would say maybe two things at the center of that for us would be, and it's at the center of quite a bit of the work that we do, is the work and the charism of spiritual direction. So spiritual
Mm.
direction, again, is a historic, charism of the church that kind of came out of this tradition. So if you meet with a spiritual director, generally that would be like once a month, you meet with a trained spiritual director that can just help you pay attention to your life with God and the things that you're praying about, your experience of God. And so, one of the things that we desire to do is to train spiritual directors within the tradition that this has come from, within the monastic tradition. And so, we have a training program that we train spiritual directors really slowly through an apprenticeship program. And our hope is that then these spiritual directors become a gift to their local church, that they become at least the kind of person that eventually could become like a spiritual mother or a spiritual father. So if you fast forward 10, 15, 20 years, we want to populate the church of the future with spiritual mothers and spiritual fathers. That's part of at the core of what we hope to give as a gift to the church. And then the second thing is just in general, we hope to renew the church with the love of God. And so we have some courses that we're working on. We have a course in spiritual friendship that we're gonna launch at local churches later this year. We have some training in spiritual companionship. We have some retreats that we do. And so just in general, we're trying to take the theology and the practice of the monastic tradition and to just scatter seed through the church in a few different ways, through courses, through the people that we sort of have on the ground in local churches, people who are connected with us, and as well as through this ministry of spiritual direction and training spiritual directors.
Jared, I want to ask you kind of a broad diagnosis of where American Western Christians are at. Because I've been trying to wrestle with like what at the heart is part of this sort of crisis of spiritual formation. And maybe one take I have on this is we don't actually, we have the worst of both worlds in terms of the inner world and the outer world. And by that, I mean, actually, we are actually so isolated from true community. Like, and all the statistics show this. People are more alone. They spend more time alone than ever before. They have, less and less relationships. The number of, percentage, I don't have the number in front of me, but the percentage of like American males that can actually say they have one close friend is just, is plummeting. It's like, so like deep relationships with others are leaving us are declining, and so we're alone. But our time alone is actually not time that is actually spiritually nourishing. Like the time alone is scrolling, watching videos, entertainment. It's actually empty. It's empty calories. It's not nourishing a solitude that is a life with God, because ultimately it is actually, you are alone. You're not actually alone with God in that sense. So it's like we're caught between, like, we don't have relationships, so we don't have community, but even being alone, we are actually just lonely. We're not practicing actually and experiencing the fruits of solitude.
Yeah.
So one of the things why I'm so drawn to monasticism is because it actually kind of addresses both ends. It gives us a picture of what it's like to actually have community, and it gives us a structure to be with other people on a spiritual journey together. And yet it also gives us the practices of when we are alone, what to do. So can you like fill that out more? Like, what other practices of that again, just even for somebody who may not join or even check out the OCL, what would you want to tell them? Here's how you should be. Here's what monasticism tells you in terms of how you should be with people, how you have to increasingly be with people more. And here's how you need to increasingly experience your life alone. Like, what would be the key takeaways for people who are caught in this whipsaw of the worst of both worlds?
One of the things I think a lot about at the end of my day is how did I love well today? And then in that question, there's this other question of like, what got in the way of that? And there's all kinds of things that get in the way of me loving. It's sort of like whatever it is, my own ambition, my hurry, my anxieties about X, Y, and Z, about getting that project done, selfishness. So there are both external things that I'm focused on that get in the way of me loving people well, whether that be my wife or my kids or my coworkers. But then there's a whole bunch of internal things that are also just getting in the way of me becoming the kind of person that can love the way that God loves. I mean, that's the goal of the Christian life, is that we are becoming people who love like God loves. And so I think I would just offer like a couple reflective questions to people. At the end of each day, ask yourself, what got in the way of my love today? And begin to pay attention to like what that stuff is, and then to bring that stuff into conversation with God. And if it's that you're just super, super anxious about what's happening in the world, that makes a ton of sense, actually. I mean, I woke up this morning and I prayed, and then I read the highlights of the New York Times, and I just felt this wave come over me, like, oh my gosh, what is the world right now?
Yeah.
Um, and but the hope is that then when we're alone, rather than allowing that to grip us, right? This is like the evil forces of the world. This is like the ruler of the world. If we can recognize that the one who lives in us is more powerful,
Mm.
and that we can bring all of that stuff into prayer and into the presence of God, and just to say honestly to God, like, God, I am so filled with anxiety in this moment. Would you love me? Would you care for me? Would you speak to me about this? Not in a way that elicits shame inside of us, but in a way that recognizes that we actually have a loving Father who sees all of it and is in the process of sorting it out.
All right, Jared, last question. If they want to pick up that breadcrumb, if they want to start exploring that trail for them, at least with the order of common life, what do they do? What's the next step for them to at least consider?
Yeah, our website kind of lays out a process. So you can go orderthecommonlife.org. I published a book in 2023 with InterVarsity Press called Finding Freedom in Constraint, Reimagining Spiritual Disciplines as a Communal Way of Life. And that sort of lays out the kind of life that we're inviting people into. And we encourage people to go through that book with a group of people to kind of stoke some curiosity around some of what we're doing.
Wonderful. Jared, thank you so much for bringing or rebringing the vision of the monastic life, especially to those of us from traditions that haven't been exposed to that. I think it's a very important vision for us to consider, for all of us to consider. I hope you've been having something stirred in you that you might want to consider. Well, what do I need to do to actually cultivate a deeper life, both with others and with God, in solitude and in community? And that at least monasticism points the way forward for many of us. Thank you so much. And for listeners, I want to remind you to please leave a review for us if you listen to us on Apple Podcasts, or leave rankings and reviews on other platforms that you listen to our podcasts. And next week, we will once again gather around the campfire.